Hello everyone, Michael from Mirrors of Consciousness and creator of the Orbifold Tarot, back again for the next part of the basics of reading with the Orbifold, numbers and elements. And so we just went over the kind of overview of each of the numbers, or rather not so much each of the numbers, but the overview of the entire number cycle or the number system. So now let's go through the specific numbers in order, each of them, from ace to 10. So aces are single. Aces are singularity. They're the root, the essence of the element that they're in. They're non-duality. There's kind of no choice in the matter. There's a singular idea, a singular action, a singular sensation or feeling, and a singular experience. Sometimes they're in the same way that we looked at that it's possible to go through the numbers from 10 to ace to go into the essence. Sometimes they're so complete in the element that once again they're just one. So we could go through all of the experience of the earth element, or all of the feelings of the water element, or all of the actions of the fire element, or all of the thoughts of the air element, and they all combine, they all come together into a singular essence, a singular root. So in a sense, the aces are the most simple number because they're just one, they're singular. But in a way, they're also the most complex because they're so complete. They're so full in their completeness that they contain everything. They contain the completeness of the element. So they're also their beginnings, they're new beginnings, and the seed of something. So the seed happens. The seed exists when something isn't yet formed. It hasn't yet necessarily been created into something. It hasn't become something, but it's certainly there. The seed is there. The seed is the essence, and so seeds are not only beginnings, but seeds are produced. If you think of a tree, seeds are produced due to the maturation of the tree. The seed doesn't make the tree doesn't make a seed unless it is fully mature and it's fairly healthy and all of those kind of things. Same with people. People, the egg and the sperm are the essence of the mature person. There's a full cycle of maturity. Okay, so maybe we're not necessarily so mature when we're able to reproduce, but the tissues of our bodies, the growth of our bodies have reached a level of maturation, of completeness that allows us then to produce seeds. So the seed contains the whole, and an entire tree, an entire forest can be contained in a single seed. So that's kind of what I'm saying about they're the simplest in a way, and they're also the most complete and most complex. Next we have twos. And the twos are about duality, choice, the split between singularity and multiplicity, really, because from the two we get everything. The one, the ace, has, in a way, in its completeness and its simplicity, it has actually very little movement. It needs division. It needs to be separated from something, and comparison. Division and comparison to become other things, and that's the two. So the two, you can see there's a split. Again, if you think of the seed and the egg has split into two cells, from a single cell to two cells, and actually between the two cells, there's a third aspect. There's a third space that's created between the two when the two divides. So on the very basic and practical level, the twos are about choice, comparison, duality, pairing. So it's not necessarily a split of the two, but it can be, if we go from 10 to ace, the two can be a coming together of two things and cooperating, converging. So it can be divergence or it can be convergence at the same time. Depends on the context in the reading, but twos are both. Twos are both. Twos are two. But in a way, too, the twos are never really only two things. The twos are almost always two things with an unsaid, a seed of a third thing in them. So if you think even of two people, it's never really two. Two people, there's one person, there's the other person, and then there's the space in between them, and the communication that happens in between them, and the interaction that happens between them. So there's kind of an unmanifested third that goes into the mix. At this point, I'll also mention that the people in interactions and seeing how the numbers show themselves to you in real life is a really great way to learn the numbers. And it may sometimes differ from what I'm saying, and that's perfectly fine. It's really what the numbers mean to you and how you experience the numbers that makes a difference. You can memorize what everybody says about the number 10, say what it represents, but if you don't have an experience of how tens play themselves out in your life, then it's just memorization, and that can have its value, but it doesn't really mean anything to you. And what I'm more interested in tarot in general, and especially when you're working with the Orbifold, is what does it mean to you? How do you interpret those things? And that's, I think, one of the strengths of the simplicity of this design, this deck, is that it leaves room for you to apply your own meanings, your own interpretations, your own associations with each of the numbers on the deck, and with the elements as well. Anyway, I'm getting a bit off topic, I'm sorry. So we go from the 2, which is duality, choice, divergence, convergence, collaboration, pairing, but with that kind of seed of a 3 inside the 2. 2, the 3. And the 3 is the manifestation of that third thing. So again, if we think of the creative process, the progenitive process, 2 people come together, and then a little bit later, a third person appears. Magic. Or just a third thing is created. In between the 2, a third thing is created. So 3s have that aspect, and 3s represent both opposites. Oh yeah, that's another thing about 2 is opposites, opposition, separation. So the 3s represent 2 opposites, so black and white, but then the 3s also represent the gray area, the compromise, the in-between of the 2 things. So it's while 2s are extremes, it represents 2 extremes. Sometimes those 2 extremes are moving away from each other, sometimes those 2 extremes are coming toward each other, but they're still separate extremes. Whereas the 3 is the connection between those 2 extremes, and the medium point, the middle between those 2 extremes, the compromise. Threes also have a level of stability to them that the twos and the aces don't. So even you can think of, often the comparison is made between a three-legged stool and two-legged stool. A two-legged stool is not very stable. It's not too likely to stand up on its own unless it's driven into the earth, but that's a different story. But once you have a third thing, there's a kind of stability that happens. The exception, of course, is a bicycle or a unicycle for the one. But in order for them to stay upright, there needs to be movement. So ace and two, there needs to be a movement going on. This is what I'm talking about, of finding how do the numbers reveal themselves in your life. So I guess we don't really see too many unicycles that often, but we see lots of bicycles. And so to stand up, for a bicycle to stay upright, it must be in motion. Whereas for a tricycle to stand up, it doesn't have to be in motion. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Three then also has movement. So you can think of three people. The conversation between three people tends to have a little bit more flow. It tends to go around a little bit more in circles and back and forth. There's more interaction between the people and more movement. Even though there's a kind of stability in the three, there's also a kind of movement in the three. This is generally true of most odds and evens. So odds tend to have more movement, they tend to be more about change, and evens tend to be more about stability and lack of change. There are exceptions, like I said, the two must be in movement, but the two actually is also a little bit of a lack of change. There's opposition. If you have two equally balanced forces that are going in opposite directions, there's no movement there. There's nowhere to go. And so you need a third or an imbalance of those opposing actions to create movement. And so that's the third. The threes then are also associated with some level of spirituality. So, I mean, they're all associated with spirituality. I shouldn't pigeonhole, but we see threes often in spiritual realms, spiritual traditions. So we have the Trinity, the Holy Trinity of Hinduism: Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, the destroyer, the creator, and the preserver. We have the Holy Trinity of the Judeo-Christian religions, Christianity in particular, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, the triquetra, I always don't say it very well, of paganism and witchcraft, which is kind of actually contained in there, in that three. So we see threes often, even in non-denominational religions, we often think of body, mind, and soul, or body, mind, and spirit. So there's a triplicate there, a three. Then moving on, we have the fours. And the fours, if the threes were the kind of stability that afford some movement, the fours tend to be a kind of stability that lacks movement. It's not that it can't move. A four-wheel vehicle can certainly move around quite well, but the advantage of a four-wheel vehicle as opposed to a three-wheel vehicle is that actually a four-wheel vehicle is more stable in those movements. Four is typically the number of rest. And it makes sense because it does have the most stability. You rest when you have four walls around you, or you rest on a stool that has four legs, or a chair that has four legs. Lots of things have four legs. We have all the quadruped mammals and animals that Um, when they're moving, they have 2 or 3 feet on the ground, but when they're at rest, they have all 4 feet on the ground. So rest is 4. Rest is, stability is 4. We have 4 walls around us. When we have a home, we have 4 walls around us, usually. I mean, some weird architectural things could happen, but generally speaking, we have 4 is a stop, is a resting point. Because there's the stability. There's enough stability in a 4 that you can rest. And there's the warning in the 4s of not being too stable, not resting back on those 4 legs or within those 4 walls. But it's a necessary rest for everything. So as we've moved from the ace, the initial idea, to the splitting off, the duality, to the collection of the 2 and becoming a third and creating a third thing, then we go to the 4, and the 4 affords just a nice little rest point. From the 4, from that stability, we get the 5, and the 5s are again about change. 5s, like I said in the previous video, are midpoints. And midpoints require some movement, some change to occur. We can also think of the numbers 1 to 5 as being representative of the 4 dimensions. So why 5 and 4 dimensions? 5 numbers and 4 dimensions. The ace, the 1 is actually dimensionless. The 1 is a point, an imaginary point somewhere that has no height, no width, no depth. So it actually kind of doesn't exist. In order for it to exist, it has to have at least 1 dimension. And for us to be able to understand something that has 1 dimension, for us to understand even just the concept of length or width or depth, we need 2 points for comparison, and that's the line. So the 1 dimension is actually 2 points, the 2. Then 3 is 2 dimensions. Whenever you have 3 points, unless they're all 3 are on the exact same line, which is very rare. Usually a 3rd point will always be off that line. And even if it's off the line only by a tiny bit, or if it's off the line by a lot, it actually makes a plane, a 2nd dimension, 2-dimensionality. 4, if you think of 4 points, 4, again, would rarely fall on the plane. It could fall on the plane, and actually it's a little bit more likely to fall on the plane than the 3 to fall on the line, but usually 4 points just thrown up in space, any 4 things in space, are going to create 3 dimensions: height, width, and depth. We can measure height, width, and depth once we have 4 points on an object. Then the 5, the 5th point, when we add a 5th point, it doesn't really change 3 dimension. You can have 4 points that have 3 dimensions, or you can have 5 points that have 3 dimensions. So it doesn't really add an extra dimension of space, but the 5 then adds the dimension of time. So it could be the movement of 1 point from one place to another, and that would be the 5. So 5 is change, 5 is time, 5 is the midpoint in a cycle. And sometimes we deal with change really, really well. People like change a lot, and sometimes people don't like change because they like the stability of the 4. So often 5s are seen as a difficult stage. You can also think of 5s not necessarily of change, but as a midpoint. And midpoints are also a little bit difficult at times. When we're transitioning from the beginning of something toward the, maybe not the ending, but the more mature stage of something, that transition between beginnings and endings can be a little bit difficult. So the 5 is that. The 5 is time and change. And 5s can also be, fives are associated with the teacher, the Hierophant card in the majors. Each of the ace to 10 are associated with majors. So the 5 is the teacher, and we learn most from change in general. We require stability in order to learn things, but the things that we learn usually are not directly from stability. They are the result of change. So that's a way of looking at the Hierophant card, which sometimes people have difficulty with, and 5s in general. So 5s are time and change. And as odd numbers, again, there's a little bit more movement to them. They're not as stable as the even numbers. The next number, even, is a 6. Let's find our 6 here. I know I'm showing you all air cards because I had separated them out for later. So we have 6 of air. Any 6s are, there's a kind of, not just stability, there's again a stability with an even number as always, but they're a different kind of stability than the 4. A 6 is, 6s move more. There's more change involved in a 6. But there's also a balance. There's going backward again to the 5 a little bit. The 5 is imbalanced. There's always kind of 2 of one and 3 of the other, or 4 of one and 1 of the other. So there's always a kind of an imbalance in the 5. All of the odd numbers, there's always a bit of an imbalance. They're rarely perfectly balanced. I say rarely because there is actually an odd number coming up that has a fair bit of balance. So the 5s are imbalanced. The 6 is balanced, and you can think of the 6 as harmony. I like to think of the 6 as harmony. The 6 has a kind of stability as the 4, like I just said, but it also has movement. It has a bit more change because the 6s are also related to 3s. So you can think of the 6 as double 3s. Again, with my analogy of seeing how people interact. If you have 6 people at a party, they will often talk. Sometimes all 6 will talk together, and that's nice. But often what will happen is they'll pair off at certain points, and so you'll have 3 conversations that are happening between pairs of people. Or at other times, you'll have 2 conversations happening between 3s of people. So, and at a party, if it's a party of 6 people, it'll kind of switch back and forth between two groups of 3 at three groups of 2. And so there's that kind of flux, that movement between 3s and 2s and 2s and 3s and 3s and 2s. And there's a harmony in that. There's rarely, in a party of 6 people, there's rarely one person left out, unless in the odd case where you have one conversation of 3 people, one conversation of 2 people, and then someone's not really involved. But there's enough movement that odd person can be picked up back into the group. So 6s are harmony. 7s, again, excuse me, sorry, dry throat. 7s, again, break that evenness. So 7s break the harmony. I like to think of 7s as the card of the individual. More so in some ways than the ace. The aces are also individual. But the 7 is the kind of individual that is a leader. So the 7 breaks through the evenness of the 6. You can think of the 7 as being 3 on one side and 3 on the other, and 1 in the middle. the leader or the detractor sometimes is trying to break up the six. So sometimes there can be a disharmony in the seven when that individual is trying to break up the harmony. So that can happen. Of course, there's other, in the seven, there's other combinations where you can have 2 of one and 5 of the other, and 3 of one and 4 of the other, and so on. But in general, it usually has to do with some kind of separation and standing alone, standing apart from the crowd, standing separate from the community. Sixes, I know, I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth between numbers, but sixes can also be thought of community numbers in some ways. So the 7 stands apart from the community, either by being separated from the community, being different, or by standing apart by being elevated above the community, or being standing alone on their own merit and becoming a leader. The major associated with the 7s is the chariot. So the chariot is yoking 2 opposing forces, and they're moving forces, the horses, that's rides, and then it's an individual who's merging those 2 opposing forces and driving them forward. And that can also happen with the 6s. It can be not just a merging of 2 oppositional ideas as it would be with the 3s, but it would be a merging of 2 oppositional communities, maybe two differing political parties, and some leader finding some way of finding the common ground between the 2 opposing parties and bringing them together, or 2 different families, or 2 different sides of a family coming together. So it's kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like the grandchild. So you have the grandmother, grandfather, and father on one side, and the grandmother, grandfather, and mother of one side, and then when the mother and the father come together and have a baby, have a child, that child, in a way, kind of merges those 2 those 2 families. Of course, the marriage does too. Excuse me, still dry throat. But that 7th, that individual, can merge them, or it can also drive them apart. There's that possibility too. Anyway, moving on. I'm sorry if it's not clear. It's not my intention to be confusing. It's my intention to show you how these numbers play out. So some of these interpretations of the numbers, definitions of the numbers, may be different than what you're used to, but I hope are showing you a different way of thinking of the numbers and applying them to real life. How do they actually show themselves in life? 7s too are 7 days a week. So we have a split between 5s and 2s, because most of us work 5 days a week and have 2 days off. Not everyone, especially nowadays. Some of us work 7 days a week, and others 1 day a week. But there's that same correlation between 7s, and so there's at least, usually, or at least if there isn't, it's recommended that there should be 1 day of rest. So again, that's kind of setting apart one thing, one individual. 1 day is special compared to the other 6 or 5, where there's a continuity between the group of 5 or 6, and there's an individuality with the single day of rest. There's also, well, I'll leave it at that. So moving on to the 8s. The 8s are, I like to think of the 8s as double stability. So if the 4s are stability as in the four corners of a square, then the eights are a cube. They're an even more solid, an even more dense um, stability. So you have the four corners of the square, and then you have the additional four corners of a cube, and so a cube is a box. And when we reach the eights, sometimes the eights can feel like we're boxed in. One of the really traditional variations of the eight of air is showing a woman bound and boxed in by swords in the ground. And she may not be able to see her way out of the box, but there is a way out. She's not confined. She's not permanently stuck. But she certainly feels that way. She feels like there's nowhere to go. She's boxed in, and it can be maybe overwhelming. Again, getting in that idea of nearing the completion of a task or of a situation, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel stuck. It can feel boxed in. There's a way out, but it can get that way. Sometimes the eights are great. A lot of times the eights are depicted negatively, but that solidity can be excellent if that's what's required in the situation. But it can also lead to stagnancy. It can be so stable that there's no movement. There's nothing going on, or it can get that way. You can get stuck in that stability to a point where it gets stagnant. Then we move on to the nines. So earlier I mentioned that there was one odd number that was balanced. That odd numbers are usually imbalanced. There's one odd number that is balanced. Well, there's two. There's the ace, but also the nine. The nine is one of my favorite numbers, actually. I kind of like all of them, but I like the nines because they have the same kind of they're a continuation of the threes. So the 3 has a balance in its triplicate. The 9 is 3 threes, triple, triple. And so there's a balance in the 9 where you can separate it out into 3 threes, and there's a stability in this 3, and this 3, that they actually, all 3 threes fortify each other. 9 is also a square number, in the sense that 3 times 3 is 3 squared is 9. So not square in the shape, but square in mathematics. And I think often we're used to seeing squares, actual squares, 4-corner squares, as being stable, but 3s are quite stable too, and counting in 3s is a different number system that some cultures have, that sometimes I think we're not so accustomed to. So 9s are, in a way, the enough movement, enough transition out of the 8, but it's also near completion too, and it can feel even heavier, even more dense than the 8s. 9s can feel more heavy, more dense than the 8s, because they're near completion. They're near completion of a cycle. We can even see the 9 as a completion of the cycle. 9s are associated with pregnancy, and because it takes generally around 9 months for humans to gestate. So it's the completion of a cycle in a way that's a little bit different than the 10. You can the 9s complete. I like to think of the 9s completing an individual cycle. And that's because the 9 is actually the largest single-digit number our counting system anyway. 9 is the largest single digit number, and so because it's a single digit number, it's the completion of an individual. It's the completion of, in a way, completion of oneness. And it can be the completion of a cycle of any of the elements, but it's the completion of a cycle that doesn't move beyond the person, doesn't move beyond the individual. The hermit is the major associated with the nines, and so he's about himself. Like, yes, he can lead others into themselves, but it's an interior kind of completion. He's got a little, certainly a high level of maturity, but it's not a social number. It's not a social being. It's not a necessarily social stage. It's somewhat isolated and isolating, which again often is depicted negatively. You know, with the Nine of Swords again, for instance, is very individual. Even Nine of Cups often is a single person with all their cups around them. So they're complete. They're emotionally fulfilled as an individual, but they're not necessarily sharing that completeness with the world, with the community around them. And so that then leads to the tens, which are the completion of the cycle moving on to another cycle, or moving on to from the individual to the community. So tens are much more communal. They're much more about the family. Nines and tens of cups and tens of coins in some more scenic decks show families, and so this is community. Whereas the 9 was the completion of an individual cycle, the 10 is more of a completion of a communal cycle. There's more interaction with people and with things. 10 is also, as double 5, it's 2 times 5, and because 5s were time and change, 10s can be the other side of the cycle. If we think of again, associating the numbers with a major, the major connected to the 10 is the Wheel of Fortune, or the wheel, and the wheel has 2 sides, so it goes kind of up one side, up from one side of the cycle, from ace to 5, and then it comes back down the cycle from 6 to 10, and so it's a completion of that cycle all the way around. The 10s can also feel very heavy, just before. 9s and 10s can feel fairly heavy just before something is burst into completion, back into individuality, into singularity. There's a heaviness to it, and for some of us, that density, that completeness is what we're striving for. We feel kind of empty or unfulfilled unless every little moment of our lives, or every little aspect, every little corner in our house, or whichever the case is, depending on the element, sometimes we don't feel complete unless all that stuff is filled, all that space is filled. And then others feel actually burdened by that fullness, that completeness. So again, none of the numbers are really positive or negative. They all contain positive and negative within them. They're just different stages in a cycle. So I hope that's given you a good overview, a good idea of how at least I see the numbers from ace to 10, and maybe a way of looking at the numbers that is helpful to you. Again, just look at how do the numbers play out in your life? How do they show up for yourself? When do you see 6 of one thing, and when do you see 3 of a different thing? When do you see 8s, and so on. So I think that completes our cycle of going through element and number. Next, we will look at how to combine elements, and some simple readings with just the minors. We'll keep it simple there. So I'll see you soon.